By the time Stephen King wrote the Tommyknockers, he had already covered a lot of ground, but he hadn't yet written a novel about aliens. King had written all variety of horror novels, dabbled in epic fantasy, composed touching and tragic dramas, and made many a social commentary under the guise of his pseudonym Richard Bachman, but he hadn't yet wandered into the realm of science fiction outside of a few short stories. But it was, of course, only a matter of time before King would try his hand at the genre and turn out what is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated and overhated books of his early career. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. On this channel, I am taking a look at every novel, short story, novella, movie, TV show, musical, and everything else Stephen King has inspired or written over the course of his prolific career. So, if you like Stephen King, horror and sci-fi content, and stylish hats, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. This is the first video in my series for the Tommyknockers, which is of course about the 1987 novel, a novel I am particularly fond of. And the second video in this series will be for the 1993 two-part TV miniseries, which I haven't watched yet, but I'm sure is just an absolute masterpiece. The Tommyknockers is a story about aliens, right? Sure, but it's much more than that. Amidst the sci-fi and the invasive alien species, there's a story of the destructive power of addiction, of the deep self-loathing those suffering from addiction can experience, and an acknowledgement of the ways in which substance abuse can destroy relationships, careers, and lives. But there's also redemption and a message of hope in the story, with what could genuinely be considered a happy ending, or at least as close as one could hope to get from an author like Stephen King. But let's do what we usually do here and provide a quick recap of the plot and what influenced King while writing the story, before we get into why I believe that this book is better than most people, even King himself, are willing to give it credit for. The Tommyknockers, a brief summary. Bobby Anderson lives alone in the woods of, you guessed it, a small Maine town. One day, while out for a casual stroll through the forest with her dog Peter, Bobby literally stumbles across something metallic that is poking up out of the forest floor. The urge to excavate and uncover this unidentified object becomes overwhelming, and Bobby sets out to do just that. However, this need to know to uncover the mysterious metal object is not an organically occurring feeling. Rather, Bobby is compelled by the forces within the object itself to dig up what turns out to be an alien spacecraft. The long-buried alien invaders gradually begin to inhabit the minds of the residents of Haven, Maine, by way of an airborne agent. At first, it makes them sick, their teeth fall out, among other symptoms, but as they become acclimated to their new atmosphere, they become the pawns of the alien race and ultimately become the vehicles by which the aliens do their bidding. However, not everyone who comes into town is affected by the alien mind control. Bobby's friend Jim Gardner, for instance, is not susceptible to the mind manipulation tactics, and it is Gard, a reliably unhinged alcoholic and reluctant hero who must save his friend, the town of Haven, and the world before the alien contagion can spread any farther. History and background. As far as King's influences for the story go, aside from the copious amounts of booger sugar he was admittedly blasting into his beak, King has cited H.P. Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space as being the foundational premise for the story. Additionally, there is a recurring poem about the Tommyknockers in the novel that King recalled from his childhood and was the namesake of the story. This fact led me to wonder about the origin story of the Tommyknockers and just what the deal was with them, as I had originally assumed the word to be something that King made up on his own, but turns out the Tommyknockers originated in Cornish folklore. The Cornish people are an ethnic group native to or associated with Cornwall, and a recognized national minority in the United Kingdom, which can trace its roots to the ancient Britons who inhabited southern and central Great Britain before the Roman conquest, which would have taken place in the 80s. Not the 1980s or the 1880s, just the 80s. AD. Cornish miners believe the Tommyknockers, or the Knockers as they were known prior to the Cornish people immigrating to the United States, were 2-foot-tall, cave gnome-like creatures who wore little miner outfits and would steal tools and food from the miners, and would also knock on the cave walls when a mine collapse was about to happen. This was, of course, like most folklore, only a fairy tale because the miners were just stealing food and tools from their fellow miners, and the knocking sounds they heard before a mine collapse was simply the mine making the sounds a mine makes when it is about to collapse. Here are a few artistic representations of what a Tommyknocker or a knocker was purported to look like. Get a load of these knockers. Here are some particularly impressive knockers. And here we have some cute little perky knockers. I'm sorry, I just ran lights for a theatrical production of Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein this past weekend, and now I've got knocker jokes on the brain.
What knockers?
Oh, thank you, Doctor.
Anyway, as I mentioned, the Cornish brought their folk tales of the knockers to the United States in the 1820s, and eventually the tales of the Tommyknockers spread throughout the country, with the superstition persisting well into the mid-1900s. In addition to H.P. Lovecraft and Cornish folklore, the book contains a critique of the dangers of nuclear power and radiation, and the incalculable, generational, negative health effects and catastrophic environmental effects that result when a nuclear reactor melts down. Guard, who ultimately is the unlikely hero of this story, spends a great deal of time railing against the nuclear powers that be and confronting those who seek to enrich themselves by building and implementing nuclear power in the United States, regardless of the potential consequences to those whose homes and families would be in the zone of contamination should the nuclear plant fail. He's an activist whose passion about the issue often gets him into trouble, but his concerns aren't unfounded and his heart is in the right place, even if his protest tactics do more harm than good. The incident at Chernobyl would have just happened the year before the Tommyknockers was published, and the event clearly had a strong impact on King. He even goes so far as to ascribe the symptoms of radiation sickness to those in Haven who fall victim to the alien atmosphere. The ship itself has its own toxic radiation of sorts that causes the townspeople's teeth to fall out. They lose their appetite, experience nausea, fatigue, and vomiting. King was very clearly taking an environmentalist stance on the issue of nuclear power and its very real danger. Reviews and critical reception. The Tommyknockers has been maligned by many a booktuber over the years. Of the various reviews I checked out, the general consensus was that the book has its share of great moments and a strong premise, but that the book is too long, unfocused, and overly descriptive. And, well, is it the most coherent, structurally sound King novel? Perhaps not, depending on whose definition of those terms you subscribe to. But if you come into a King novel expecting concise, to-the-point narratives and rapid-fire plot points, well, you clearly don't know or perhaps have forgotten who King is as a writer. If you're not interested in learning the intimate backstory of each and every member of an enormous cast of characters, hundreds of years of history of the town the story is set in, being subjected to the occasional story within a story, and wading through arguably overly descriptive lengthy tirades, then Stephen King isn't for you. A lot of the critics seem to think that King introducing us to so many townspeople and their lives and perspectives was unnecessary, but let's not act like this is the first and only time King has done this. Salem's Lot, It, Needful Things, Under the Dome, The Stand, these are all stories that give us a multitude of characters, some of which can seem inconsequential to the overall story, but it's rarely a criticism I hear about these other novels. Under the Dome being the one exception to that statement, but I disagree with that criticism as well. When it comes to the Tommyknockers, though, even King himself has called it an awful book. The Tommyknockers was notoriously written at the peak of King's cocaine addiction, and was the last book he wrote before cleaning up his act, so it's understandable why King might look back on this particular novel with less than nostalgic fondness. But he and those critics who agree with him all seem convinced that the book is bloated, and that were you to edit down the novel by half, that it would improve on the story overall. Which I simply don't agree with. If you were to trim the fat and boil this story down to just an action-packed alien invasion sci-fi extravaganza, you would potentially sacrifice the relatable human experiences that make up so much of King's best work. Who would Ben Mears from Salem's Lot be without his tragic backstory? Who would Jack Torrance from The Shining be without his history of cyclical familial trauma? What would the town of Castle Rock be without its elaborate centuries-long history lessons? It's the attention to detail that gets us to invest in the characters and the settings and to form a deeper, more complete understanding of just who these characters are and of what's at stake. Does King get carried away on occasion? Sure. Is he at times descriptive to a fault? Yeah, I suppose so. But to cut a novel like Tommyknockers in half would be to risk losing those personal connections and details that make us root for and, in some cases, against his characters. Imagine only getting the half of the book It when the characters were all grown up and never meeting them as kids. Imagine not getting to know each and every vital character from The Stand, characters who are all so unique from and important to each other, or not knowing why the pet cemetery is haunted. Personally, I'd rather get all the backstory and intimate particulars that King has to offer than potentially forego that deeper understanding and personal intimate experience. But that's just me, though. Concurrent redemption arcs. Jim Gardner is a writer with an addiction problem. His life is falling apart entirely due to the fact that he can't control his drinking. He's just starting to find success, to hit his stride, and he finds himself throwing it all away because of his inability to refrain from overindulgence. He knows what will happen to him, that he isn't his best self when he drinks. He knows that his bad habit will likely ruin what little credibility he has managed to establish. He knows he can't control his behavior when under the influence. He knows his habits are destroying his relationships and his reputation, and yet he can't stop himself, can't help himself. And it takes a major wake-up call and hitting rock bottom to bring him back from the brink of taking himself out of the game, so to speak. Considering what we know about King's own battles with addiction and how the Tommyknockers was his last hurrah before climbing on the wagon, it's safe to say that Gard was in large part inspired by King's own struggles with addiction. All that stuff about Gard sounds more than vaguely familiar, right? Not only does it sound a lot like what King was likely going through at the time he was writing the book, it's a recognizable and relatable story to anyone who has known or experienced a deep-seated addiction once the hooks are in good and deep. King was off the rails while writing this book, or rather, he was doing the rails, to the point that his wife was ready to leave him. He was at risk of throwing it all away, of doing irreparable harm to himself, to his still developing career, to his family. He was hitting rock bottom while writing this book, and he, not for the first time, wrote himself into the story. But like Guard, King does eventually defeat his inner addiction demons. They both find a reason to stop the self-defeating, ruinous behavior, and it's not for themselves, not for their careers. It's for the people who they love, for the people who love them, for the people who need them, for the people they can't bear the thought of losing. And those relationships, that love, prove stronger than the power of seemingly insurmountable addiction. And while King may not have single-handedly saved the human race from an imminent alien mind control takeover and fly a spaceship into the vastness of outer space to rid the world of the toxic invaders, there are enough similarities between King's personal struggles and that of Guard that it seems unlikely that their redemption arcs aren't essentially intrinsically intertwined. Final thoughts. The Tommyknockers is a great book. This isn't the first time I've disagreed. The Tommyknockers is a great book. This isn't the first time I've disagreed. Why can't I fucking talk? The Tommyknockers is a great book. This isn't the first time I've disagreed with the popular opinion or with Stephen King, but I feel strongly that were you to trim this book down, it would be a less enjoyable, less emotionally affecting story. And that's why I read King. I mean, aside from the thrills and chills, of course, but if all I wanted was shallow shock schlock, there are plenty of other authors who can provide that. But when it comes to making you feel the entire gamut of emotions, no one scratches that itch quite like King for me. And it's because of his willingness, or perhaps helplessness, to give you all the information you need and then some. And Tommyknockers is no exception. He even nailed the ending on this one, in my opinion, which is something King is often criticized for failing to do. You should read it. My next video will be for the 1993 two-part TV miniseries adaptation of The Tommyknockers. I've only seen a couple of clips of the show at the time, and to say I'm apprehensive about this one would be putting it gently. Frankly, it looks fucking awful. Please consider liking this video. If you're not subscribed, please click the subscriber bell to get notifications. Thank you to all of my subscribers and constant commenters for watching and leaving me your thoughts in the comments section of all of my videos. I love to hear from you, and I appreciate your contributions to this channel. I'll see you next time, whenever that might be. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.